Marcus, as always, a pleasure to see you. Marcus,
see you too.
Marcus and I have known each other for 7 or 8 years now, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when we met, but he made quite an impression in a large salmon outfit that he has when he was promoting his game Discount Salmon, which is a fantastic, immediately engaging game. But Marcus and I have known each other for a number of years through the convention circuit. So both of us travel and attend a number of conventions. I've mentioned them in class before, called proto spiels or unpub, which are basically events across the country that people go to that are focused almost completely on just playtesting. So a lot of designers and playtesters get together and showcase their games in the sort of state that we're going to have this semester. They're not finished, they're not final, they're not ready for the marketplace yet. They need feedback. So we've met each other at a number of them, some in Minnesota and down in Madison, but then also at a few other conventions. I think did we run into each other at Gen Con? I'm not sure.
Almost certainly. I've been to a lot of Gen Cons at this point.
And then Geekway to the West in St. Louis. So we've known each other for quite a while. He's been really gracious with his time to join for my winter class as well. And just overall, Marcus, you're a swell guy.
Oh, thanks.
So, but I wanted to get some of Marcus's insights because his Kingmaker game is one of the print and play games that I had shared with the class when we were looking at transitioning from the more traditional group-based games to now these individual games. And I know Marcus is founder of Water Bear Studios. Studios can, encompass a wide variety of people. So how many people are there in Water Bear Studios?
There are two. It's myself and my cousin Kara. That's the entire operation.
Yep. And so you do the game design. I know Kara's a graphic designer and artist and does a lot of the visuals for the games that you work on too. So one of the things right now for our print and play project, because of the protocols that our students are separated and working on their games alone. So that's one of the things that I want to talk to you in just a little bit, is that designing under pressure, designing like in a vacuum. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into gaming and what it was that made you decide to go from just being somebody who games to somebody who designs games?
That's kind of fun. So I guess I've always been into gaming at some level. But for the actual game design as more than just a hobby for fun, I didn't really get back into the kind of modern style of hobby games till 2003 when Catan landed in my world. I played every game I could get my hands on, and then sometime, 2011, 2012, somewhere in there, I started designing games for real with an eye towards maybe someday getting these onto the market. Yeah, for real. I mean, like, when I was 7 or 8 years old, I made a Ninja Turtle game every 3 weeks, so it's just different.
So what was the first game that you would say that you designed as a game designer, the one that you wanted to say, you know what, I like this idea and I want to see it go to the next stage?
That was a game called Volcano Sacrifice, which has gone nowhere, but it was an idea. Basically, you'd have a giant volcano and sacrificing things into it to earn victory points, but honestly, just the fun idea of just tossing stuff in a volcano. It didn't go anywhere, and it was designed primarily for a contest. Mm-hmm. That game still has done nothing, and the backup plan for that contest was Discount Salmon, and we put that in.
Yeah, so Discount Salmon is the first game that I saw that you had designed and you had shown me before, and that's what I call a small footprint game, which is a type of game that I've been really pushing with the students. So that a lot of the games that we play in class are small footprint games that generally have a really quick setup time, relatively short component list, easy to set up, short play time, easy to tear down, but there's enough gameplay in there that you can play it several times and hold a discussion about it, rather than a larger game like even a Catan takes a little bit longer to set up. It's going to take longer to play, and it's hard to imagine 4, 5, 6 sessions of that over the course of a semester for a classroom to have a conversation about. And it seems that a lot of the games that you design fall into what I would consider those small footprint games, or also sometimes people will refer to them as like lunch games, lunchtime games, a game that you could reasonably get out over lunch period and break open with 2 to 4 friends and sit down and get a complete game session in. Now, did you find that that's just where your kind of design tendencies lie, or has that sort of been a goal of yours along the way?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I discovered that unless you're extremely good at just a level of mathematical design I have not yet really exercised, you're not going to be able to play in the area of a 2-hour, 3-hour event game against the masters at that level. If you're going up against Stefan Feld, I don't know if somebody's going to give me $60 for a game, and it's my first one that's that size. So that, and it's just, for me, more fun to play a game that I can play in 15, 20 minutes, and it's easier to design those simply because I can play test it with more people more often and faster. It's less of a demand all the way around, and if you can get the price point down, it's easier to sell.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, too. We don't really get into talking about production of games in GDD 100, which is the intro class that eventually leads to their video game curriculum. But in the winter class that Marcus joins in as a guest sometimes, that one is literally called Board Game Production and Processes. So we really do look at the cost advantage of smaller footprint games. And we start talking about the price savings that you get if you're printing 500 copies versus 5,000 copies. There's a huge, huge difference in the cost per unit. So sometimes starting out knowing that you're going to design a game with only X number of components can be helpful. And then designing back from there, you know that you're going to be within a certain price point. And sometimes that's going to be the determining factor on whether or not a publisher will look at your game as something they might be interested in picking up. So in general, would you say that you've got a design outlook or philosophy or style, or do you just design what comes to mind? You just design what sounds like fun, or do you have something deeper at work here?
Mostly, our core design philosophy is to get people off their phone, get them interacting together in ways that we wish we could do right now. But mostly, I design my games around a moment I want the players to experience. Just a lot of my games have had chaos as the moment of things to enjoy, but I've been just whatever it is, I want like the fun thing, find out what that is, and then just keep hitting it over and over again.
So one of the things that I bring up in class is the takeaway experience. And I try to describe that as when your game is over, what's the thing people talk about? You know, when somebody asks you about game X, what's the first thing that pops to mind? Or when you share that story with somebody the next day, usually you're going to remember something very positive or something very negative. So a lot of designers, and it sounds like what you're saying is like you really look for those moments that are going to be the ones that let people share those stories that they're excited about. You know, if nothing else, man, when we play that game, like Bees, for example, is a real-time dice rolling game that gets really frenetic that Marcus designed. And when I saw that at Proto Spiel a couple years ago, I'm like, man, I got to sit down and play that game. And it was hilarious because we're all rolling dice at the same time, and people are grabbing stacks of flowers off of different decks and trying to complete these things to pollinate cards. And it's hilarious. And the fun moment was just the chaos of reaching for stuff, but bumping somebody else's hands and trying to furiously do all this stuff at the same time. So it was a really easy game to share stories about. And that's one of the things that I really like sometimes about these smaller footprint games. There are huge games like Gloomhaven or Scythe or things like that that are these big, sprawling, epic 1, 2, 3 hour games. and it can be hard to boil that down to just some individual moments. But I find with some of these smaller games, those moments are things that you can specifically design for or around. So, all right, for argument's sake, Marcus is going to design the next great game. Trust me, you will.
That sounds great.
Do you have a process on where you start? Like, how do you take the initial idea, that first germ of an idea, and nurture it and start to work on it, where you get to the point? My students just submitted proposals for print and play games, and I'm pushing them to what I'm calling the minimum viable product, that alpha build. The first time that they put enough components together to test their theory to see if it actually holds water. Like, what's your process from initial idea to getting to that point where you can start to play around with it and go, yes, this is going to work, I'm going to invest more time in this, or, you know what, I'm going to backburner this and maybe focus on something else?
A lot of it is I start with whatever initial idea or moment or thing I want to explore is, and separate it from the concept of the game. Just what is the smallest number of bits I can put together to test this idea, and I put it on a table as soon as possible. I'm not. It's like if I'm taking any notes, they fit on a Post-it note. It's not a deep thing. It's not something I'm regarding as precious. It's just okay. Let's figure out this idea. Does it do anything? So for bees, that started out with blank cards, and I put stickers on them, and then wrote numbers on the stickers. So I just had cards and sleeves, and then I had regular sized dice, nothing special about them. And then I just tried some real time stuff and see if any of it works.
Yeah, and that seems to be something that you see a lot at these proto-spiel type events. You and I did that when we were designing. I didn't do it. Like one night when it was really late and we were kind of in our giggly phase, had this idea of the Usual Suspects kind of movie concept of creating a game about nobody taking blame for things that were happening. And we just grabbed some cards off the table and started to handwrite. I remember Kane Klanko, the designer of Fuse that some of you might have played, does that a lot, where he'll just go over to a table of pieces and just grab some at random, take them back to the table and go, all right, what can I do with this?
Yeah, and I'm definitely a components first kind of person where I just grab a bunch of bits, and as representative as I can get to my concept as possible, that makes me happy. But just put something on the table that gets my imagination going. Just feeds the ideas.
So would you say then, like, theme is one of the last things that you go with? You make sure that functionally and mechanically something works first, and then you try to figure out, all right, what does this feel like? Or when along that process do you start trying to find a theme that helps sell that mechanic?
Sometimes it comes about naturally. I mean, with these, we didn't even have a scoring mechanic. We didn't have the physical placement of things. You just collected cards and you just put them in a stack in front of you. There was not really a victory point concept. It was more, whoever got the most cards. And it's like, that's terrible. So then the idea of, hey, I took these things, I need to do something more interesting with them. And then, like, physical placement, tile laying sort of idea. Once they went to hexagons, bees just kind of fell out of it. And it really matched the concept of how the game played. The marriage was so good. It was just like, okay, well, we can just run with that. They made almost no changes when I took that from my prototype to the publisher.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a really interesting thing about a designer is you'll design a game on your end that you're happy with, but then you turn it over to somebody else. Unless you're doing it on Kickstarter, or unless you're going to put up the capital and the money to publish it yourself, you're basically at the mercy of a publisher who will sometimes say, hey, I love this game, but let's change the theme. I had done a game about war that one publisher wanted to change to a game about like cultural development and things like that in Greek times. I'm like, but that's not what the game is. And so then that game just languished on a shelf for a couple of years. And finally I'm like, you know what, maybe I need to be a little bit more flexible. and let the publisher decide. But have you worked with publishers that wanted to make some pretty dramatic changes to your game, or do you find that those relationships work out pretty well and there's a back and forth communication with that? What's your experience been?
So far, my experience has been pretty good with publishers. By the time my ideas get in front of them, I have pretty polished looking prototypes, and the amount of work left on their end is their own playtest validation, and they're generally happy with what I've done. So I haven't had a lot of conflict. Mostly it's just, I know I have ideas about what I think the game needs, and they'll have differing ideas, but they're the ones putting up the money. They're the ones taking all the risks. So even contractually, I don't have the power. And if I really wanted the power, I'd do it myself. And it's just a lot more work. So giving up control, it's definitely something to get used to.
It can be different, and I've had to mention that sometimes to students, that you start out with an idea, but eventually becomes somebody else's product. And sometimes changes are going to happen. Even with some big name licenses or products like a Star Wars license, the producer and the licensor are going to make changes so that it fits with whatever their contractual obligations are. But I'm glad you had mentioned that by the time it gets to the publisher, your game is pretty polished. Because I know for a lot of publishers, they will review prototypes that are in various stages of completion. So for you, your standards are pretty high. I think, like mine are, that when you do show that game off to somebody else, you want it to look as good as possible. You want to showcase yourself in the most positive light. So what are some tips that you might have, or what is your process like for taking that early thing that's on index cards and scratched out with markers and building it up into a prototype where you're happy to share that with others? Like, how long does that take? What steps do you take? When is it okay to start sharing that?
It's definitely a process, and it depends on the game and its complexity level. But for me, my initial prototypes start with whatever garbage I can cobble together. Once I get it to a point where I've play tested it with enough people that it's fun and interesting enough that it's something I'm going to continue working on, I'll fire up the computer and design cards that facilitate making the game easier. So if something needs to be read from across the table, I'll make big cards and make sure that it's a size and presentation that it fits where it's going. If the card's going to be in the hand, the triangle portion of it facilitates gameplay. If it's going to be on the table, it's possibly physically a larger card, maybe a different shape. Whatever I design, I'm trying to design it at the size that the production version would be and present things in a way that gets everything about the presentation of the game out of the way so I can focus on what the gameplay actually is and is it working.
No, I think that's a great point, because early prototypes might be sketched out, might be handwritten, things like that, but there reaches a point where you need your prototype to accurately reflect what the game space is going to be like. So students, I want you to visualize, like, what is it going to look like when 4 people sit down to play your game? How much space does it take up? If they've got cards in front of them, that means that they need to be able to read the cards in front of the other players as well. If there's a board in the middle, then you need to make sure that the information on the board is accessible to all the players at the table. And that might be represented with the size of the font or where you place information. But I'm glad you mentioned that the early stages, it's just do what you can to get your idea down. But eventually, you are going to need it to be as representative as possible, even if it's not visually, artistically, graphically, finished or fine. It needs to at least represent what you think the final game space needs for people to be able to interact with your game ideas. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I'm at. And if we get to a point where even that goes well, that's when I'll involve Kara and show her the complete game, and then we start collaborating on what could this look like if we made a production version for either producing ourselves or for a publisher to reproduce. So for Bees, we had a really decent looking prototype. They hired 2 different artists and went their own way and designed a game that's functional. And it looks pretty good in some aspects. I have some qualms with it that they could have done better, but that's theirs. But for Let Her Go, that is Kara's artwork. That is everything in the box we designed. They just WizKids just put it out the way we did it.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a really, really cool feeling when that happens. It can be a big surprise when a game hits the shelf and that's the first time you see it, and then you see the changes that were made.
Yeah, that has not happened to me yet. But that I can imagine that'd be jarring.
That happened a couple times, like with Blood Bowl Team Manager, and even the first X-Wing. When X-Wing first came out, I opened up the box and there were some things in there that were not quite what I remember submitting. But, you're at the mercy of the publisher. Let's talk a little bit about creativity and steps that you can take. I believe that creativity, especially spontaneous creativity, is a skill. We start each class period with a Mad Lib. Just something light and fun to start the day with that gets people in the right mindset. And if somebody shouts, "Give me a noun" at you, and you're able to come up with one, it gets easier the more you practice it. Design is another thing like that, and being creative is not always easy. Since you're basically the designer for Water Bear Games, and while you've got Kara to help with, it sounds like you still make the main design decisions, right?
Generally, yes.
So what are your steps, or what are the tips and tricks that you've come to learn to help with brainstorming, to help get you past a roadblock when you've kind of hit a wall with where a particular creative path is taking you?
It depends. If I just want to just creatively try stuff, I'll go to Board Game-izer and just have it throw stuff at me and see if I could just deal with what it meets out. So it's just a website. So this one gives you a mechanic, a theme, and a victory condition. Other things I might try is if I'm stuck on something, I'll say, what's the wrong mechanic to put into this game? And then try to shoehorn it in anyway and see if it falls apart or if it works, or just throw in something completely out of left field, or take something in the game that's limited and just make infinite of them. Just see what happens. See what breaks. Just push on something. I don't know. It kind of depends on how I'm stuck. I do have one game I'm stuck on that I've been working on for a few years, and it's a very simple game. The problem is there's nowhere to hide any flaws, and then it's abstract. So if you don't find something, if it's not coherent when it's on the table, it'll just completely fall apart. So I'll be working on that one for a while.
Well, you mentioned something interesting with going with the wrong mechanic or making a big change. One of the things recommended by one of the books that I really like is changing the magnitude of an outcome. Where if you make a small change to a game, sometimes it can be hard to observe the impact that change has, especially because you're only playtesting so many times. But if you make a huge change, like suddenly instead of 10 points, this thing is worth 50 points, or instead of having an attack value of 5, it now has an attack value of 8. When you make a big change, you can see really, really quickly the impact it has and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe that is the area that you need to be working on. Maybe that's, even if it blows up in your face and it's wrong, that's useful information.
And all it costs you is time.
Yeah, which, while it's not an unlimited resource, it's better than investing time in layout and production and a higher-looking prototype and then finding the same thing that you could have just by adjusting some rules and giving it a shot.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about playtesting then, because that's something else that my students are going to be dealing with. Now, when you've got a multiplayer game, do you ever find yourself playtesting where you're occupying all the player spots before you take it to a group? And if so, what are some of the things that you look for what I've been calling actionable information, actionable intel. Like, what are the things that you look for when you're playtesting? And if you do playtest solo, what are some tips, or how do you go about doing that?
All right, so I absolutely test all of my games solo before I waste anyone else's time with them. So, which just generally involves me. I wish I had a lazy Susan. I could just turn all the positions instead of getting up and physically moving from one spot to the next, or just dealing out several hands of cards. But I try to forget what I've seen from the prior hands and go, if this is my hand, what am I doing at this position at this time? What information is the game giving me? What can I infer about my other players' hands or the deck or something else? But generally, I try to make sure the first version I put on the table is at least playable. It may not have a victory condition, but there should be enough of it existing that I have goals that I can meet out of having other people test it. It's like, is there at least some component of this that I can meet out?
So it's interesting too, because I do find that often, not just myself, but with students, they've got mechanics at work, they just don't always know where they're going to lead to yet. And that's fine. It's okay, right? You don't need your journey and your destination. You're not going to have the entire roadmap, poof, exist out of nothing. It's very, very rare when an idea goes from initial inception, and that's the same idea all the way through to final execution. So would you say then that a lot of your games are that way, where you start out with the mechanic and you can play and you're not quite sure where you're headed to? You kind of see where the mechanics lead before you decide what an end condition is? Or do you find that that's not always the case, that sometimes you need that end condition first so you know how to kind of steer your mechanics?
I would say, especially even for my published games, there's not, like, the game that I started out with does not resemble the end game. And that's okay. It's the early playtests have just enough components to test the ideas. And I would let's see, I have some of those around here somewhere. I wish I'd prepared better. I could actually show you what those things look like.
Well, one game that we do have access to, because I shared the PDFs from Kingmaker, is like, how did that game start out? I mean, that's a print and play game. Was it aimed and targeted to just be a print and play? Like, was that a print and play project, or was that a game that after you had designed it, you weren't sure where else to put that? How did that come about?
That game, we started with the idea of anti-set collection. We just do not want to collect sets. And I'm just not actually sure what to do with the game, so it's kind of living as a print and play until I either get back around to doing something more concrete with it. I could show it to publishers, but I'm not certain that it's right for the market right now, and it could be cleaned up. And it just made the flow a bit better to my mind. I feel like there's a bit more setup than there is gameplay right now. It's a lot of squeeze, but not much juice is the way they said it.
So one of the unique challenges facing design with a print and play game is there's this balance between the burden that you're putting on the player to scrounge materials they might need, because you're not going to print dice, for example, and the burden of how much content you give them that you can reasonably expect them to print out, cut, and assemble to be able to play a game. Do you think that there's a certain maximum style of game, or a certain amount of material that you could realistically expect a player to? I mean, it's a cost that you're asking them to absorb in time and in resources to be able to print stuff out. What suggestions would you have, or what guidelines do you think there might be for what you could reasonably expect a player to provide versus a player to print out and make when you are designing a game?
Well, when I'm specifically designing a game, I know the barrier has to be low, but the print and play community is varied for those event level games that are 2 or 3 hours. The people that will print and play that type of game are willing to do anything. I have seen incredible print and plays where someone has just taken the assets, uploaded them to like drive-through cards or something, and actually had cards produced and sent back to them, and then get the boards done. And I'm like, you don't need to do all of that. If you're going to have just a typical, like right now, I think Cards Against Humanity put out a family version of their game as a print and play in the last week or so.
That's called Apples to Apples.
Yeah, you would think so, but it's actually the Cards Against Humanity format, which is just a little bit different than Apples to Apples. But yes, they're just jokes you tell each other.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've seen some people like they'll do 3D printing. They'll 3D print models for a print and play game. But I think that's one of the extreme ends. For most people, I think that you could probably reasonably assume they'll have some 6-sided dice. They'll have access to tokens, beads, coins, things that you could use as markers. And then printing out cards and printing out small tiles. Like if you're going to do a game board is one of the big challenges of the print and play game, because you've got to always break things down into 8.5 by 11 units of components. And 2 8.5 by 11 sheets might be as big as your game board can be, just for practical purposes of asking them to print things out.
Definitely the case.
So, like, if you were to decide, you know what, I want to kind of check out what's out there, and I'm going to go look for a print and play game because, hey, there happens to be a pandemic going on. I can't go out to my local friendly neighborhood game store and look at a game. What would be some things that you would look for in a print and play game, either with the description to catch your attention or with the components that would make you go, you know what, I want to check that thing out?
For me, it's generally a unique idea that I haven't seen before, and probably keeping it under 10 pages. It's a lot of cutting. And then it's like, working on a print and play means I'm not working on my own games, and I'm already looking at finished games that I haven't had a chance to crack open. So if I'm going to download a print and play, it needs to be radically interesting in some way.
No, that's a really, really good point, because the opportunity cost for students is if they're spending time printing out, cutting, and assembling your game, that's time that they're not working on homework for another class. That's time that they're not working on their own print and play if they're also in GDD 100. But I like that 8 to 10 page threshold is usually what I'm looking at. And for me, that includes the rule book. So if the rule book is maybe 2 pages long, then maybe 6 to 8 pages worth of components. Cards are easy to cut, but I also encourage people, use right angles. The right angle is your friend with print and play things.
Yes.
So don't make circles, right? Triangles work too if you line them up right. But circles are the worst component that you can include in a print and play game, because they are just a pain in the arse to try to cut out and assemble, especially if you've got many of them in your game, like coins. I'm okay with square coins, or I'm okay getting pennies and nickels.
I have circle punches, so I'm fine with them.
But you're not everybody.
I'm not. I agree to that. I understand that, but yes.
All right, so because you do, I want to go back to design for a bit, and because you do design so many of your games solo, are there times when you're like, you know what, I'm at a point where I do need to reach out to somebody, I need that sounding board, I need somebody to bounce ideas off of? And if you reach that point, what steps do you take?
Well, all my games I do like to play test with other people. We have a game design group here in Omaha. It's called the Spiel Masons. I actually started the group several years ago. I think I've got a link to that here. I'll just send you. We meet every week at Spielbound, or at least under normal conditions. And we play test each other's games. We give feedback. And we're a pretty successful group. So the giveaway game at Geekway last year was Among Thieves. That was by Floyd Pretz, who's in our group, and it brought that to our group many times. And For Glory is a game that was recently on Kickstarter. Those guys have been working with us for several years, and they've finally got their game out, and it's their first project, and they're actually producing it themselves. So it's actually really nice.
Yeah, I remember seeing it.
Having that as a resource. Yeah, really great.
So this is just one thing that I think in general for creatives, but particularly for game design. You can get skilled and better at designing solo, but I really think that just having a support system, I know that Seppi Yoon, a designer here in the Twin Cities, refers to it as having a battle buddy. Just having somebody that you can either send an email to or do a Skype call with, bounce some ideas off of. I know a really common concept, particularly at Protospiel events, is I'll show you mine if you show me yours.
Definitely the case.
Right, where you'll either work with another designer or a group of designers, and it's like, all right, we'll spend the next hour looking at my game and talking about that, and then we're going to look at Bob's game, and then we're going to look at Jane's game, and then we're going to look at Amy's game, and you just take time working around, and the community that you can get can generate far more ideas than you can by yourself. So I'm really trying to encourage my students that, yes, it's inconvenient right now. You can't just go down the hall of your dorm or go to another classroom and grab people. You can still set up a Discord channel. You can set up a Skype call. You can set up FaceTime, and you can still do these things the best that our technology can accommodate now. So use other people the best you can. Yeah, the For Glory was a fantastic one. I got to meet him quite a few years at Geekway, and that thing funded really quickly. I was amazed and really, really happy for them that it funded so well. It's a really, really fun gladiatorial combat game. But would you have any other suggestions for people getting into game design as a skill that they are looking to develop? And for these students, this is the first step among many years in the game design program until they graduate with a degree in video game design. But I think a lot of the same foundational skills and ideas for tabletop design apply. What are some lessons that you wish you would have learned earlier on, or what are some tips or tricks that you could offer to somebody kind of starting out their adventure in game design?
Oh, geez. One of the things is know you're going to do a lot of work that's not going to go anywhere. You're going to have to throw it away. So don't get attached. Don't be precious. And like your prototypes, spend as much time as you need on them to make them good for the level that they need to be at the moment, but no more. Don't try to make perfection your first time out. Play a lot of games. You need to know what's out there so that you don't accidentally just recreate something somebody else has already done and then try to sell something that you can't possibly sell.
Yeah, for the students, I call that building your game literacy. The more games you play, the better, right? Tile placement games, if you've played Carcassonne, that's great, but there are a lot of great tile placement games out there. So build your game literacy, and you can play games online through Brettspielwelt or through Tabletop Simulator, or in a recent assignment, I had them watch a whole bunch of tabletop videos. Go watch Will Wheaton in his game, play some games. You can learn a lot just by watching play sessions of other people. And in this time, that is great access if you don't have copies of games and readily available people right now. You can still get that by watching other people play, by talking about it with friends afterward, and absorbed by observing.
A lot of times I just end up reading rule books to games that I don't have access to, just to see what the ideas they are playing with look like.
And you can get rule books for just about any game, either from the publisher website, because they want people to learn about their game, or from BoardGameGeek.com. You can look up just about any game that there is, more than 150,000, I think, in their database. And in the file section, most of them will have a downloadable version of the rulebook, whether it's the official version that comes in the box or whether it's somebody who translated it or whatever. But the content is out there. I guess if students have questions that they'd like to ask, they can start sending them to me via direct message in Teams, and then I can bring them up. Otherwise, another question that I had for you is about accountability and milestones. Now, we're in the unique situation here where we have a semester. There's a discrete endpoint by which their work must be done. One of the traps that I think of being a designer, a freelance designer, or a self-publisher is that there's no external force saying you have to be done by June 3rd or whatever it might be. So when you're designing games, how do you keep yourself on task? Do you set milestones? Do you set reminders? Do you carve out time? Like, what do you do to make sure that your ideas keep moving forward?
The thing that's worked the best is giving myself hard deadlines by entering contests. And contests do two things for me. One, they have a discrete deadline. It has to be done by X point. And all of the contests have rules, some sort of constraints that, like, your game has to fit inside a mint tin, or your game has to use worker placement. It gives me some constraint I have to work within and a time period. But that helps me the most, because when I just have it wide open and a publisher will take a look at it the next time I see them at a convention, at least the convention gives me a date, but it doesn't force me down a particular path with the game. It just produces urgency.
I like that you mentioned constraints. Sometimes people think that an open world sandbox is great, but I've seen just as many people paralyzed by the fact that of all the things in the world, they can do any of them. But I find that constraints can actually really engender creativity by forcing you to think nimbly around these constraints, right? Like if you only have so many elements to play with, or it can only be so big or so long or so whatever, that still leaves a lot of design space open, but at least it kind of steers you in a particular direction. Have you found that?
It definitely does. And that is, one of the things. Okay. All right. So, yeah, here's one. I didn't realize that was out already. So, on the Frosthaven page, I'm going to be designing a scenario for Frosthaven that just got announced today, I guess. So, that gives me a very strong constraint and a very strong deadline. I'm sorry, I lost the question.
Oh no,
realize that was out.
Designing within constraints can actually be liberating by removing some of the things that you can't do, so you can focus on the things that you can.
Definitely. So, like for Frosthaven, there's going to be certain things in the box. I can't add anything to that other than some cards, maybe, and rules. I'm going to have to constrain myself to what he has available. The good news is it's a really big box, so I have a lot of toys to play with.
Yep. That was the same thing with Siege of the Citadel. That was a huge product, so there was a lot of room in there to play around with, but there were still, just for practical purposes, some limits based on what they can produce and the time frame that they have. And it's fun working with other people's stuff, but you also have to be very mindful that it's their game or idea or license, and you're just contributing part of it. So that's a case, especially if you're working with the licensed folks, like a Lucasfilm or something like that, where you're playing by their rules, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of room for creativity.
Yeah, they do have very strong controls when you start looking at licenses that are big like that. So I've talked to Jonathan Ying about this. He did the Power Rangers game for Renegade, and trying to think, he's did some other games that have very strong licenses. And literally, the artwork on a card has to go through lawyers and levels and creatives, and like, I think he said they had to take shoelaces off the character because there are no shoelaces in Star Wars.
No shoelaces, like that. No shoelaces, no buttons, no buttonholes. There are only certain sorts of strappings and connectors that there are. I mean, Star Wars has some really weird, finicky guidelines that you would not know until you run into that.
And there was no paper up until it showed up once. And they're just like, what is that?
There was absolutely no paper in Star Wars until we see it in Last Jedi, at which point I like shrieked "woohoo" in the movie theater, and people were wondering what the hell. And Trisha's like, it's because of the paper, isn't it? Yeah, it's because of the paper. It wasn't the action that was going on.
I'm like, what? How do you not know your own stuff? It's like, okay.
Yeah, like my students didn't know that I'm a big nerd, right? Spoiler alert, yeah, Jay's a nerd. But anyway, so before I let you go, Marcus, is there anything else? Are there any either words of wisdom or tips you'd like to pass along? Anything a mentor may have kind of imparted upon you in this industry? Like,
this is supposed to be fun. If you're not having fun, stop doing it.
Oh, that's a good point, especially for students who are freshmen now. If this is what you're going to be studying for the next 3 years in hopes of being able to do this as a career, you've got to be able to learn to enjoy it. Not every single moment needs to be fun, but you have to be able to find the joy in the process, the joy in the creativity, and the joy in the product that you're creating. You're creating memories for people. And I think that's a really unique thing that gaming does that not a lot of other industries do. Your game might be the first big intersection with gaming that somebody gets, right? A lot of my students, they remember their first D&D session. They remember their first game, or they playing Risk or Monopoly with a sibling. Somebody designed those moments, right? And you could be designing the next moment for someone else.
And I hope you get fulfillment out of that, because you probably won't get very much money.
Yeah, that's another thing about the game industry. It might be a little bit more in the video game industry, especially if you're working for a AAA publisher and title. But for tabletop gaming, the margins are razor thin, and they're probably only going to get slimmer in the short term with the shipping and other issues that are cropping up because of the transportation and other protocol issues in place. But it's really, really hard to beat the feeling, in my opinion, from having somebody come up and say, man, I really liked your game, or I broke out that game over the weekend and showed it to my mom or showed it to my kids or whatever it might be. I think the joy is one of the reasons why a lot of game designers do this.
It doesn't get old. It's always great to hear.
Oh, yeah. I never get sick of people heaping praise on me. Oh, if only they would. Anyway, Marcus, it is always great to see you. I wish it could be in person. Hopefully we'll see each other at Geekway to the West later this year. Hope everything hasn't been canceled for the rest of the year, but it's always great to see you. Thank you very much for sharing your time with me and my students. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope you are able to ride out the rest of this pandemic in style, my friend.
All right.